So when we think about governance and modern day corporate governance, et cetera, and when I'm teaching, a lot of the emphasis is on, again, what is typically referred to as like an INED or independent non-executive director. But I teach business ethics, and one of the things that I often tell my students, especially if we're talking about this topic, is that really INED, I tell them it's a different acronym. I say that it doesn't just mean independent non-executive director. I say really the purpose of that is I need to make ethical decisions, right? Because that is basically, like, if you think of like what is the core point of bringing in external people to provide this kind of governance body, it's really just that. It's like they're independent, they're not connected in terms of like salary, et cetera. And their goal is just to say, look, we're gonna help you strategize and we're gonna help you avoid any bad behavior. So if I was to kind of turn it back to you and look at it more professionally, rather than just using that acronym, what are the core functions of a board and how do they kind of protect or act as a protector of the organization?
Well, I mean, I think in addition to the board helping with the strategy and the long-term growth of an organization, like you said, I think it's very important for the board to act as a protector or the gatekeeper for the organization, to really step back and look at the overall picture of all aspects of the organization, and making sure that if there's any particular risks that are coming the organization's way, that it's managed, and helping the management of the organization look at any problems or issues that might come up, look at compliance issues, and also to make sure that everything in the organization is quite transparent, in terms of making sure that financially that everything is sound, because really, you know, as much as an organization is the vision of its founder, right? So the founder is driving the organization, but once it's on its road, the organization is an entity within itself, right? So the board is there really to protect the entity, to make sure that it grows. And so sometimes you might even see the board disagree with a founder, right? Because their role is not to you know, push forward necessarily the founder's agenda or what the founder wants. Ultimately, it is to make sure that the organization flourishes, and their responsibility is for the organization, more than for an individual, a founder or an ED.
Yeah, like very famously, Steve Jobs being pushed out of Apple the first time, et cetera. Okay, so that sounds great, and I think it makes sense, but I want to make sure that we're not, it sounds like these boards are really, really involved from an operational perspective. And so I think, just to kind of pull back on that a little bit, I don't think what you're saying is that they're going to be, in fact, we've recently had a conversation about a smaller organization where there was some conflict between the expectations of the board and the ED. The board members were maybe getting involved in areas that he felt was his domain. He probably didn't understand like their perspective and why they wanted him to go in a specific direction. So how, what is that kind of balance in terms of like operationally and decision making? Because we talked about leadership. Like, at what point do they kind of need to extract themselves, and what are the specific areas that a board should be focusing on, generally speaking?
I think the board should be generally focusing on the vision and the mission, of course, again, and really the overall sort of overarching pathways to get there, and not so much with the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day operational tasks that it would take to actually achieve that vision, right? So, you know, if the board is there to help with the overall 5-year or 10 or 3, 5, or 10-year strategy, where they want to get to, what certain big milestones might be. But a board is not there really to figure out, well, exactly how do I get to the first milestone, or how do I get to the second milestone, and really leave it to the executive director and his or her team to really plan out the specific activities that's going to help the organization reach those milestones. And the board obviously has a role, as I mentioned earlier, in risk management, right? And so it's very important for the executive director and the board to have good communication, so the board is aware of the daily operational activities and can maybe, if they see certain risk factors, bring that up so that there's discussion with the executive director, but really to give the executive director the discretion to be able to run the day-to-day of the organization. Because after all, they have hired the executive director to help the organization reach those milestones and to reach that vision. And it's really not the role of the board to actually, I guess, get their hands dirty in the daily operations in order to reach that vision.
Yeah, so you mentioned the idea of the board being a bit of a protector and focusing on the most important issues. What do you see as some of the core ethics or even legal issues that a board should be focused on to ensure from a risk management perspective that the leaders of the organization, the EDs, et cetera, are not making decisions or taking risks that are illegal or unethical or otherwise would lead the company into some type of negative outcome?
Well, I think legal and compliance issues should always be one of the things that are on the top of mind of boards. I think in terms of risk management, there's always obviously laws of each country that have to be followed, and compliance issues, regulatory issues that oftentimes boards should really be managing and looking over, which is why, one of the side point is that it's important to always have a lawyer on the board to be able to look at these issues and analyze risk in different ways. But as a whole, for a board, I think there are a lot of different duties that they have, but two of the most important ones, I think, is the duty of loyalty to the organization and duty of care and the duty of diligence. And what I mean by the duty of loyalty is that when you sit on the board of an organization, I think the top thing that you have to remember is that your loyalties really lie with that organization, not with the individual founder, or sometimes, board directors might have conflicts of interest. Maybe they have interest in another organization that for some reason is entangled with the organization of which they're on the board of. But in those cases, there are certain steps that they need to take to be able to either recuse themselves from making decisions, because they have to remember that if they're with a certain organization, that organization is at the top of their priority list at the time that they're making that decision. The other side, the other duties that I mentioned in terms of duty of care and duty of diligence, I think it's really important for boards to manage risk by looking at all the details of every issue, right, that might come up, or if there's potential problems that might come up, to not only study the issue, but get outside help if they need to, or research laws or regulations, or really look into the details of the situation and be diligent about asking those questions and finding out answers before decisions are made.
Yeah. So, okay, lot to unpack there, which was great. You kind of talked around specific types of risks, and typically what you'd hear, there's always some type of financial risk, maybe fraud, embezzlement, some type of white-collar crime aspect of it. There's always kind of the founder mythology type of thing in terms of rubber stamping or maybe not performing diligence or performing that outside function that a board member needs to, because they're just kind of following what the founder says, et cetera. And broadly speaking, headline risk, and you never want your organization to be mentioned improperly, like within the headlines. I think there's a lot of great high-profile examples of this in the past several years. Just curious if there's any that kind of stand out to you that you think are good examples of what not to do, and we can often learn from bad examples as well. From a legal perspective, what are some examples of like what not to do?
I mean, one example that I love to talk about, and was also a great TV show, is the example of Theranos in the U.S., where there was a medical technology company. The founder was a young woman who I think went to Stanford, but dropped out to start this company, and that supposedly had this magical technology where they could take a drop of blood and diagnose, all sorts of medical issues with it. And it was supposed to be a way, at a very economical price to be able to do medical testing that otherwise could be, cost way too much. And she basically had this board built of really, high-powered executives, politicians, former politicians, CEOs of companies, and really people that knew what they were doing, who'd been very successful in the corporate world, but who came in and didn't really ask those questions, didn't really do their diligence when she brought news about developments in the company. They didn't really question sort of everything that had been going on in the company, and really perpetuated a big fraud when it came out that the technology actually didn't work. And really that, to me, is a shocking example of really a lack of duty of care. Really, if somebody tells you something, you don't just believe them. Right? You have to really do your own research in order to make sure that everything is going according to plan and it is what the management of the company says it might be.
So if you could go back in time and advise the board of directors of Theranos, again, an extremely influential and powerful group of almost completely men, other than Elizabeth Holmes herself, what would you advise them from a board governance perspective?
I think it would be really because as far as I can remember, there weren't that many people with very technical expertise on the board. So if there was anything regarding the technology that they needed outside verification or outside proof on, to really reach out and do their homework and get others maybe from outside the organization to prove some of the concepts and to really question, I suppose, some of the things that Elizabeth Holmes might have been saying. Not from an outset of distrust. I think that's also important to note. Like, you don't want, if you're sitting on a board, you don't want everything to be like the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, it's not antagonistic.
It's not antagonistic, right? But you want to make sure that from the point of view that you're satisfied, that as an individual board member, that you're satisfied that things are going as planned, and not to take somebody's word for it.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of a core thing to remember, is that, number one, from an antagonistic perspective, whether you should join the board of an organization is often a question of fit, just like it would be with any other type of appointment. But then specifically, once you choose to be a board member, you need to be comfortable with the amount of information that's being given, the way that it's being given, the speed in which it is provided. And if you do not feel comfortable with that, then you always have the ability to vote with your feet and leave the organization and separate yourself from that responsibility. And I think that's something that, from a Theranos perspective, many of the directors that actually I think were responsible, they did ask questions, they didn't get the responses that they needed, and they didn't feel comfortable, and so therefore they left the board. So, yeah.
And I think one important thing, in addition obviously to doing the homework and looking into the facts and doing your research, I suppose the softer side of being on the board is this relationship building. Like you said, there has to be, building a relationship between the board members and the executive director of the organization, and making sure that there is a level of trust, right? That has to be earned over time, right? And that comes from good communication, that comes from a shared understanding, a shared passion, a shared vision. So really building a community of people that are all working towards the same goal, which is to try to get the organization to reach its vision.
Yeah.